Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. As always, every once in a while, I like to give the full audience a sneak peek of the kind of thing that we're doing over at Western Civ 2.0. Western Civ 2.0 is effectively a reboot of the original feed, but in much greater detail, and especially with the earlier episodes, a lot higher audio quality. It's the primary way that supporters of the show can help keep things moving. For $1 a month, you get free episodes of the normal feed every single month without any ads. And for $2 and up a month, you can support the show and get access to Western Civ 2.0. The episode that I'm sharing with you right now is episode 73, Tiberius Gracchus. As you know from the original feed, I absolutely love Roman history between the end of the Punic Wars and the rise of Caesar Augustus and his ultimate triumph at Actium. This is my favorite period in all of history, and I'm so excited to share this episode with you. So if you enjoy it, please feel free to check out Western Civ 2.0, and you can get a free 7-day trial. You could probably binge all the episodes if you want to. Right there, I usually try to release about 3 hours of additional content every single month. So, hope you enjoy episode 73, Tiberius Gracchus. In 146 BCE, Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson of the famous Scipio Africanus, watched as Carthage burned to the ground. This was the culmination of 3 wars lasting over a century. In the end, Rome had won the Punic Wars. Carthage had lost. As a consequence, Carthage was no more. Cato got his wish. But alongside Scipio Aemilianus, watching the great city perish in flame and fire, was a young teenager by the name of Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. The Gracchi were an illustrious family. Livy called the young Tiberius by far, quote, the most able and energetic young man of his time, end quote. His father had won 2 triumphs, but he had died when the young Tiberius was but 10 years old, hurling him directly into Roman political life. Tiberius's mother came from no less distinguished family. She was the daughter of Scipio Africanus. So Tiberius had big shoes to fill on both sides of his family line. After her husband died, Tiberius's mother did not remarry, even turning down a marriage offer from the king of Egypt. Instead, she utterly devoted herself to her 2 sons, Tiberius and Gaius. As he grew to maturity, young Tiberius was admired for his intelligence and dignity. According to one writer, he was possessed of, quote, brilliant intellect, of upright intentions, and the highest virtues of which a man is capable when favored by nature and training, end quote. He was an eloquent speaker and on track to meet the very high standards by his father and become one of the leading men of his time. Now, in order for her family fortunes to stay under one roof, Tiberius's mother had arranged for her daughter to marry her adopted nephew. Nonetheless, Aemilianus himself, even though she didn't like Aemilianus personally. Still, she consistently pushed her son's ambitions by reminding them that the Romans still referred to her as the mother-in-law of Scipio Aemilianus, but yet the mother of a Gracchi. Despite any family drama, Aemilianus was obligated to bring his teenage brother-in-law to the siege of Carthage. When Carthage finally fell, Tiberius was there to watch it burn. You might have expected the young man to enter into a military career, as his father had, But Tiberius was not destined to spend his life fighting Rome's external enemies. Rather, he would spend his life in the Forum and the Senate confronting another of Rome's enemies, this one of its own making: economic inequality. In the end, it would be economics, not distant kingdoms or barbarian hordes, that would destroy the Roman Republic. After the Second Punic War ended in 202 BCE, the economy of Italy endured a massive change. The legions that conquered Spain, Greece, and North Africa came home with riches on a truly unprecedented scale. A proconsul returned from a campaign in the east, carrying 137,420 pounds of raw silver, 600,000 silver pieces, and 140,000 gold pieces. That's just one person. Tiberius's own father returned from a campaign in Spain with 40,000 pounds of raw silver. This massive load of treasure that would have been unimaginable to the austere Romans of the early Republic. But by the middle of the 2nd century, Rome was truly rolling in the cash, and it was the cash of the conquered Mediterranean world. This newly enriched Romans spent their money on a variety of luxuries. Now, Romans could buy fine carpets, silverware, embellished furniture, jewelry made of gold, silver, and even ivory. The influx of this wealth began to concern some senators, as we know. In fact, we've already met one. For as early as 195, Cato was warning his colleagues, quote, "We have crossed into Greece and Asia, places filled with the allurements of vice, and we are handling the treasure of kings. I fear these things will capture us rather than we them," end quote. Every couple years, the Senate would attempt, at least, to rein in the ostentatious displays of wealth, but the resulting laws and limitations inevitably went unenforced. Look, the conquest of the Mediterranean meant huge reservoirs of wealth were pouring into Rome. But it's important to note, the spoils were not shared equally. Far from it. For the majority of Roman citizens, the conquest of the Mediterranean meant loss, not prosperity. Here's what I mean. In the beginning, Rome's wars had always been fought close to home, but the Punic Wars had forever changed that. No longer could a legionnaire fight and be assured he'd be home in time for the harvest. Thanks to these endless wars, it simply was not worth it for a man to return home to a neglected farm and then spend the time and energy needed to bring that farm back to productivity. And this is where the wealthy patricians stepped in and made the matters all the worse. These men had all the riches of the conquered world at their disposal. Now they spent this money scooping up dilapidated farms from soldier farmers all too eager to sell. Even those farmers who did not want to sell could easily be bullied. This was the age of the latifundia. These were massive commercial farms, owned by the wealthy and worked by slave labor. For I suppose it wasn't quite enough that the men who had won these wars had their farms bought out from under them. But in addition, the influx of captured slave labor meant that in general, the labor market was depressed. Not only did you no longer own a farm, but they didn't need you to work it. As the historian Diodorus observed, quote, "Thus, a few men became extremely rich while the rest of the population of Italy grew weak under the oppressive weight of poverty, taxes, and military service," end quote. Tiberius first confronted these new economic realities early in life. According to one pamphlet later written by his brother Gaius, quote, Tiberius was passing through Tuscany and observed the dearth of inhabitants in the country, and that those who tilled its soil or tended its flocks were barbarian slaves, end quote. According to little brother Gaius, this was the very moment Tiberius first seriously confronted the need for economic and social reform. It's no doubt that this apocryphal story is propaganda to some extent, but it's true. It captures the essential policy going on, the dislocation of poor families from a traditional Roman way of life. Now, some displaced rural citizens made their way to the cities in search of work. There they discovered that slave labor had already beat them to the punch and flooded those labor markets as well. Some of these rural citizens did stay in the countryside and worked as essentially sharecroppers for their landlords. The landlords loved this arrangement. The workers did not. But the poor and middle class in Roman society had an important protector, and that's where our story really begins. The title of that protector was the tribune. The tribune's job was to protect the plebeian class from the abuses of the patricians. Throughout the 2nd century, the tribunes grew in both power and performance. Throughout the early history of the Republic, plebeians were required to declare their vote aloud in the assembly and for all important elections. Clearly, this meant that their powerful patron patricians could monitor their votes. But then, in 139 BCE, a tribune introduced legislation to change that. Over a series of decades, the secret ballot slowly became a part of all Roman elections, which, as we will see, will have profound consequences. Another consequence of all this economic change was, of course, for the military. For centuries, the Roman military had relied upon yeoman farmers to fill the ranks of the legions. Throughout the Punic Wars, the property requirements for participation in the legions had been reduced, but by 146 most men could not even meet the bare minimum property requirements. Roman generals were now finding themselves having to recruit from a steadily declining pool of available men. Smash cut to the year 137 BCE. That was the year that Tiberius Gracchus was elected to his first major post, that of quaestor. Tiberius was then attached to the command of the consul for that year, or one of the two, Gaius Hostilius Mancinius. And with Mancinius, Tiberius landed in Spain, which was the appointed province for that council, in the spring of 137, to continue the war against the Numantines, a Celtiberian tribe that had managed to resist all Roman attempts at pacification/conquest. Upon arrival, Tiberius found himself caught up in one of the most embarrassing defeats that the Roman legions ever suffered. The consul, Mancinius, was much more of a scholar than a soldier, and the experienced Numantine guerrillas simply ran circles around the guy. After a series of poorly executed skirmishes, Mancinius attempted a strategic retreat under the cover of darkness, but discovered as the sun rose that his entire army was surrounded. Having fallen prey to Roman treachery before, the Numantine leaders demanded young Tiberius Gracchus be sent forward to negotiate. While serving in Spain a generation earlier, Tiberius's father had brokered a relatively equitable peace treaty with the Numantines, and they remembered that name. On his first campaign, and with as many as 30,000 lives on the line, Tiberius managed to negotiate a treaty that allowed the legions safe passage out of the region in exchange for a pledge of future peace. Though there was really nothing else Tiberius could have done under the circumstances, when Rome heard about this surrender, the senators tripped over themselves, talking about just how humiliating this had all been, especially the terms of this negotiated agreement. The Senate, of course, recalled Mancinius and all of his staff to explain what they had done. Though the embarrassed Mancinius attempted to justify his conduct, the Senate simply smacked him down. They stripped him of his consulship and ordered him to be taken to the gates of Numantia in chains to sign Rome's rejection of the treaty. The Numidians responded by simply sending Manzinius back to Rome with a message that, quote, a national breach of faith should not be atoned for by the blood of one man, end quote. Tiberius and his fellow junior officers escaped official censure for their role in the scandal, but they still got a severe tongue lashing from the Senate. I'm sure Tiberius didn't expect to return home to a hero's welcome, but the intensity of the Senate's reaction seemed a little disproportionate to what he had done. All he had done, after all, was save tens of thousands of men from certain death. Did the Senate really expect him to choose voluntary mass suicide? But in contrast to the self-righteous fury of the old men in the Senate, when Tiberius emerged from the Senate House, he was greeted by cheers from the families of the men that he had saved. Now, it didn't take long from Gracchus to recover from this quote-unquote scandal, I should say. Maybe it didn't take long for the Roman state to provide him with another opportunity for success. You see, the Roman elite were just as worried about the manpower shortage as Gracchus. A few senators believed they had hit upon a solution. The problem was that Roman law on private property was airtight, as were some of the requirements for serving in the legionaries. But these senators realized there was plenty of ager publicus, or public land, that could be redistributed. Hence, these senators determined to introduce legislation to do just that, and they called it the Lex Agraria. As the Romans conquered Italy, they typically confiscated a third of the defeated enemy's territory and turned it into state-owned public land, or ager publicus. In the early days of the Republic, it was converted into a colony, but by Tiberius's day, it was usually just leased to individual renters who would work the land in exchange for a portion of the produce. To prevent rich families from monopolizing the state lands, the assembly passed a law that no family was allowed to lease more than 500 iguria, which is about 300 acres, of public land. But this prohibition was generally ignored. The magistrates tasked with enforcing the limits were themselves wealthy landowners, and so it was for everybody's purpose to collude together and just get away with it. The legal rationale of the Lex Agraria was simple. The 500 iguria prohibition would be strictly enforced. Anyone caught occupying ager publicus over the legal limit would be forced to relinquish the excess land back to the state. The state could then divide up this land into small manageable plots and redistribute it to landless citizens. Since the whole point of the reform was to build the class of small holders of land, the bill stipulated that the newly created plots could not be broken up and sold. The authors of the Lex Agraria didn't want to hand a plot of land over to a poor man just so he could turn around and sell it to a rich one. Now, somewhat counterintuitively, the senators crafting this piece of radical reform legislation were not just like radical agitators. Rather, they were some of the more powerful men in Rome. The group was led by Tiberius's father-in-law, Appius Claudius Pulcher, who was Princeps Senatus. Joining him were a prominent pair of brothers, the wealthy scholar Publius Licinius Crassus Musinius and Publius Mucius Scaevola, one of the most respected legal theorists of Rome. There were other prominent senators and rising young nobles surrounding Claudius's group of reformers. Among them, of course, Tiberius Gracchus. For historians, one of the most controversial aspects of the Lex Agraria is where the authors intended only Roman citizens to qualify for the allotments, or whether non-citizen Italian allies also qualified. This is not clear. The Italians provided a lot of the manpower for the legions, and Tiberius himself was personally concerned about their plight. According to one source, quote, lamenting that a people so valiant in war and related in blood to the Romans were declining little by little into poverty and paucity of numbers without any hope of remedy, end quote. But whatever the original intent, there's no clear evidence that the Italians were ultimately included in this redistribution program. It seems like an obscure point, but the fight of the Lex Agraria was already a test of Roman willingness to treat the Italians as equals. In this respect, it's a test that they failed. Historians also still argue about the motivations of the men who wrote it. Maybe they were acting on high-minded principle and simply wanted to restore the citizen farmer and rebuild the manpower reserves of the legions. But it could also be that the law was kind of a cynical issue, designed to add thousands of new clients to potential networks of its authors. Traditionally, the man tasked with distributing the land absorbed the families that benefited onto his client roles. And it's here that maybe we can detect the source of some intransigent opposition to the bill. Because, perhaps, what the Lex Agraria wanted to do was take all the miserable tenants attached by default to their landlords and transfer them in political allegiance to this new faction, the Claudian faction. This, to many in the Senate, would be an intolerable shift in the balance of power. A piece of legislation this controversial and far-reaching wasn't something that you could just put together on a whim. Claudius, Scaevola, and Musenius would have spent years carefully studying Roman law, laying out how the survey process would work, and who would arbitrate contested claims. But once the law was written, they just had to wait for the right time and the right person to introduce the bill. For that, Claudius had his eye on his talented son-in-law, Tiberius. While the authors of the Lex Agraria waited to introduce their legislation, the unpopular war that Tiberius had been involved in continued. With each passing day, with each new casualty, with each farm falling into disarray, the war grew more and more unpopular. Plus, much like the Vietnam War in American history, it seemed to be a pointless exercise without a clear objective. With people losing hope, the Roman Senate decided the time was right for the return of a hero. Long ago, the Senate had passed a law prohibiting a man from holding more than one consulship. Now, they promptly disregarded that law and elected old Scipio Aemilianus as consul, the hero of the Third Punic War. He was given Spain as his province and almost immediately left. And here's the catch-22. Scipio Aemilianus had been totally opposed to literally anything that Claudius had wanted to do. If Claudius said the best color was blue, Scipio Aemilianus would simply shout that it was green, and so on and so forth. The two men opposed each other on everything. Timing is everything sometimes in life, and with his key rival out of the way, it took no time for Claudius to pounce. He promptly grabbed his son-in-law, Tiberius, by the arm and told him to ram the Lex Agraria through the assembly now. Within months of Aemilianus's departure, Tiberius stood for the tribunate. The office was slightly beneath him, but he felt it would give him the opportunity to repair his reputation and vault back into the Roman political rat race. Now, meanwhile, Claudius was attempting to work his legislation through the Senate, but having no luck whatsoever. While the Ager Publicus might technically have been state land, the reality was large landowners had, for decades in many cases, considered adjacent public plots of land to be simply their own. They had improved on it, and they were loath to give it back, especially not to some shiftless rabble. No matter how many concessions Claudius made, the majority of the senators wouldn't accept it. So Claudius ultimately gave Tiberius the nod, and he introduced the bill directly to the assembly of the people, without having the Senate weigh in on it or approve it first. To be clear, this was never done. But this is going to be a century for breaking norms. According to Roman law, after a bill was introduced in the assembly, 3 market days had to pass before it could be voted on, with market days occurring just about once per week, the interval between the introduction and the vote could be anywhere from 18 to 24 days. This delay allowed time for voters to make their way to Rome for the vote. Since Tiberius was tapping into real resentment, dispossessed citizens flooded into Rome over the next 3 weeks. Even non-voting Italians showed up in order to show their support for the bill. They couldn't vote, but they still wanted to register their physical and psychological support for land redistribution. During these weeks, Tiberius regularly addressed the citizens in the forum to harness and solidify their energy. He planned to have a large and eager majority in the assembly when it came time to vote. After 3 market days had passed, Tiberius convened the assembly on the Capitoline Hill to consider the Lex Agraria. The space was packed with voters. Before the official presentation, Tiberius defended the Lex Agraria with a lengthy oratory. The Gracchi had been trained by some of the best orators in the Mediterranean, and Tiberius perfected an irresistible calm and dignified presence on the stage. He didn't pace the rostra, he didn't beat his chest. He stood perfectly still and allowed the force of his argument to hold the audience's rapt attention. According to Plutarch, Tiberius composed himself in the center of the rostra and delivered an impassioned defense of the common people of Rome. He said, quote, "The wild beasts that roam over Italy have every one of them a cave or a lair to lurk in, while the men who fight and die for Italy enjoy the common air and light, but nothing else. Houseless and homeless, they wander about with their wives and children. It is with lying lips that their commanders exhort their soldiers in their battles to protect sepulchres and shrines from the enemy. But they fight and die to support others in wealth and luxury." End quote. After bringing the assembly close to tears, Tiberius requested the clerk read the bill in preparation for the vote that he knew he was going to win. But as it turned out, senatorial opponents of the Lex Agraria had also been busy. Knowing that they would lose the vote, they had recruited Marcus Octavius, one of Tiberius's fellow tribunes, to prevent the vote from even taking place. One of the most powerful weapons a tribune wielded was the veto, meaning literally, "I forbid." A tribune could veto anything, at any time, for any reason, and not even another tribune could overturn it, so you can't veto a veto. So when the clerk rose to formally read the Lex Agraria, Marcus Octavius stepped forward and vetoed the bill. Everything stopped. The vote could not take place until the clerk read the bill, and so long as Octavius maintained his veto, the bill could not be read, and the vote, therefore, could not take place. With the proceedings ground to a halt, Tiberius ended the assembly for the day. After trying the carrot with the patricians, multiple concessions for the Lex Agraria had already been offered. Tiberius decided to use the stick. He would make villains of the nobility and paint them as the transgressors of the people. He would strip all the concessions to the wealthy from the bill and present it something purely in the interest of the plebeians. Then, surely, he thought, Octavius would drop his veto. Now, each day, the two men argued their case in the forum. Now, if you've ever been, you know the Roman forum's not that big of a place, it just isn't. The two speakers could easily hear one another and oftentimes engaged in open debate. Exasperated at one point, Tiberius offered to personally buy all of Octavius's ager publius if he just dropped his veto, making the assumption, therefore, that the only reason Octavius was vetoing the legislation is he didn't want to lose his land. But even that effort failed. With traditional debate and persuasion failing to break the deadlock, Tiberius got radical. He promised he would veto every piece of public business until Octavius relented. Then he walked up to the Temple of Saturn and locked the state treasury with his personal seal, so that, quote, none of the usual business was carried on in an orderly way. The magistrates could not perform their custom duties. Courts came to a screeching halt. No contract was entered into, and other sorts of confusion and disorder were rife everywhere, end quote. Tiberius then ratcheted up the dramatic atmosphere. Alluding to reports that his enemies planned to assassinate him, he now carried a concealed short sword in his cloak and surrounded himself at all times with thousands of dedicated followers. But when the assembly convened again, it remained deadlocked. Octavius continued to veto even the reading of the Lex Agraria. Now, previously, when a bill like this had clear and overwhelming popular support, a tribune withdrew their veto after just kind of making a show of their disapproval. Never before had a tribune so obstinately blocked the will of the people. Tiberius tried then to go back to the Senate to see if maybe it would broker a compromise. But all the senators were willing to do was heap insults upon the unfortunate tribune. He left the chamber in an even worse mood than before. Blocked again by traditional avenues, Tiberius tried something unheard of. When the assembly reconvened, he introduced a bill to depose Octavius from his office, arguing that if he stood against the will of the plebs, that he was no tribune at all. No one had ever done anything like this before. Octavius stood calmly by, listening to it, and then decided not to veto the bill. He could have, but he realized that would start a riot. Instead, Octavius determined he would go down as a martyr. The Romans voted by tribe, and there were 35 of those. After the first vote came back, 1 vote to depose, Tiberius halted the proceedings. He turned to Octavius, and he begged him to just withdraw the veto from the land bill. But Octavius would not. The next 17 tribes voted, all to depose Octavius. The bill passed, and Octavius was stripped of his office. This vote was a turning point in the battle over the Lex Agraria. Until then, Tiberius still enjoyed the support of many senators and his fellow tribunes. No longer. They all saw him as a reckless demagogue, as a danger to the Republic. Tiberius was now toxic. But for the moment, Tiberius didn't care. His fate was now tied to the Lex Agraria, and with Octavius out of the way, it passed overwhelmingly. The Lex Agraria called for a panel of 3 commissioners to survey the ager publicus, determine ownership, and then parcel it out. To make sure the job was done properly, Tiberius induced the assembly to elect Tiberius himself, his father-in-law Claudius, and his 21-year-old brother Gaius to serve as the first 3 land commissioners. Obviously, this concentrated power in his hand as well. So far, so good. But it turns out, like even it is today, passing a law and enforcing it are 2 very different things. Unable to prevent the law from becoming law, conservatives in the Senate hit back with their own bag of tricks. The opposition, now led by the Pontifex Maximus himself, the lead priest, Publius Scipio Nasca, who hailed from a more conservative branch of the Scipii clan. Nasca personally possessed far more than 500 illegal plots of Ager Publius. So, he engineered a blow to this new land commission. It was the Senate's responsibility to appropriate funds to pay for the men and material necessary to complete all the surveying work, which would require massive numbers of secretaries, clerks, surveyors, architects, carts, and mules. At Nasca's urging, the Senate voted practically nothing to cover merely the daily expenses of the commissioners themselves. This left Tiberius the captain of a boat with no oars. It was infuriating, but there was nothing Tiberius could do about it. Shortly after being dealt this blow, one of Tiberius's closest supporters suddenly died, and he suspected foul play. The increasingly paranoid Tiberius already kept his family surrounded by an informal group of friends and clients, really permanent bodyguards. Whether he was just playing to the crowd or genuinely afraid of his life, Tiberius donned mourning garb and brought his children to the assembly, where he, quote, begged the people to care for them and their mother, saying he despaired of his own life, end quote. But then fate intervened. King Attalus of Pergamum died. He had no children and feared a dynastic struggle would tear his kingdom asunder. So he bequeathed the whole thing to Rome. Suddenly, Rome found itself the owner of a prime piece of real estate on the Aegean coast of what is today Turkey, without so much as having to spend one drop of blood in getting it. Quite the coup. Tiberius jumped on the turn of events. He had Attalus' will read publicly, which read, quote, let the Roman people be the heir to my estate, end quote, putting the emphasis on the word people. Then he declared that the popular assembly should be in charge of how Pergamum was to be divided up, not the Senate. Moreover, the money from Attalus' vast treasury, Tiberius argued, should be used to fund the land commission. The response to this from the Senate is nothing less than apoplectic. They went through the roof. By every right of custom, the Senate enjoyed full discretion over both state finances and foreign policy. Polybius said the Senate, quote, has the control of the treasury, all revenue and expenditure regulated by it. It also occupies itself with the dispatch of all embassies sent to countries outside of Italy for the purpose of settling differences. The people have nothing to do with it, end quote. By laying claim to Pergamum, Tiberius was attempting to wrestle away both foreign policy and finances from the Senate at the same time. The Senate met in a furious session, denounced Tiberius as a reckless demagogue, and began to start allegations that he wanted to be king. And there was no word in the Roman lexicon more hated, more feared than king. Now, Tiberius followed up on this with another bold announcement. He was running for re-election. Technically, this was not against Roman law, but no one had ever done it before. To the Senate, it certainly looked like Tiberius was endeavoring to set him up as a king, at least in all but name. But the elections of 133 BCE didn't go as Tiberius planned. The Senate made it known that they no longer opposed the Lex Agraria. I mean, why would they? It's passed. And this made it just a lot less essential for Tiberius's base of rural voters to show up to vote, undercutting his support and forcing Tiberius to court the urban poor. Land reform had never been of much interest to the urban plebs, so Tiberius had to broaden his platform to include further limits on military service, the right to appeal the verdicts of judges, and barring senators from serving on juries. This last one drew one of the great political battle lines of the entire late Republic, though for the moment no one acted on it. Ever dramatic, Tiberius donned black mourning clothes again in the lead up to the election and went around with his children, securing pledges from his supporters to protect them if anything were to happen. The night before the final election, Tiberius slept surrounded by armed bodyguards. Early the next morning, Tiberius' supporters packed the area near the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill to ensure that they controlled the voting space. Accompanied by bodyguards, Tiberius himself arrived and was greeted by cheers and applause. When the opponents of Tiberius arrived, they found themselves outside, unable to push through the mob. Prevented from accessing the voting stalls, when the anti-Gracchus voters heard the call for tribes to begin voting, fights broke out on the edge of the crowd as opponents tried to push their way in. This halted the voting. Now, meanwhile, the Senate was convening just around the corner. Rumors swirled that Tiberius had deposed all the other tribunes. He was preparing to assume kingly powers. The proconsul over the Senate that morning was none other than Marcius Scaevola, one of the authors, actually, of the original Lex Agraria. Nascia, the other hardliners in the Senate, demanded Scaevola do something. But the consul replied that, quote, he would resort to no violence and would put no citizen to death without a trial. If, however, the people, under persuasion or compulsion from Tiberius, should vote anything that was unlawful, he would not regard that vote as binding. This was not good enough for Naskia, who rose in response. He said, quote, "Let those who would save their country follow me." Naskia then donned the formal attire of the Pontifex Maximus and put himself at the head of a mob. Together they marched to the Temple of Jupiter. Now, as always, weapons were not permitted to be carried within the sacred city limits of Rome. Naskia and his followers armed themselves, mostly with table legs and other things like clubs. Though the coming attack was not premeditated, it was clear that they were willing to use force to beat back Tiberius Gracchus and prevent him from becoming the king of Rome. Tiberius was still on the rostra when the mob approached, though he was warned. At first, Tiberius' supporters readied themselves to fight, but hesitated when they saw that the crowd was led by none other than the Pontifex Maximus, the head priest of Rome, and they started to give way. As the senatorial mob pushed in, however, Tiberius' men fought back, and in a moving skirmish developed. In the ensuing fight, over 300 men died. One of them, Tiberius. According to our sources, he tripped over the body of a fallen supporter, and before he could get up, he was beaten to death by the leg of a bench. Appian recorded the incident as follows, quote, "So perished on the Capitol while still tribune, Gracchus, the son of Gracchus, who was twice consul, and of Cornelia, the daughter of that Scipio who robbed Carthage of her supremacy. He lost his life in consequence of a most excellent design too violently pursued. And this abominable crime, the first that was ever perpetrated in the public assembly, was seldom without parallels thereafter from time to time." End quote. It had only been 13 years since the fall of Carthage. Already Rome had turned on itself. The day of Tiberius's death had been one of the bloodiest dates of the Roman Republic. Note, I said to date. In just a few short months, a simple land redistribution bill had led to bloodshed in the Forum. The Senate made no apologies for the attack. Tiberius and his dead supporters were denied traditional funeral arrangements and were simply dumped into the Tiber. This, in and of itself, was also a shocking affront to tradition. The Gracchi were still a powerful family. Denying their son a proper burial was fraught with religious and social implications. But that wasn't the story. The story now was that Tiberius had been trying to make himself king, and the Senate determined they had to do everything to stop him within their power, and that giving such a man a funeral would be an affront to Rome itself. But as I said, it had been just over a decade since the end of the Third Punic War, and the Republic was already tearing itself apart. And oh, the death of Tiberius Gracchus was merely the beginning.